Charles Lewis, your organization, the Center for Public Integrity, just published a study on the presidential candidates' advisors. Why did you title it Under the Influence?
Basically, we look at our political process and we assume that everything is hammered out based on logic and ideas and this lofty, almost conceit that it's all fairly sanitized and almost not of this world. And very little attention is ever paid to the advisors or the people behind these candidates. And so this was the first attempt, I think, that I know of to systematically list the men and women who had sort of circled around these candidates or been summoned by the staffs, either way, to give them ideas about policy. We thought it was kind of interesting and kind of exciting because it shows, well, you can get a lot of information about why a candidate says what he says, why he does what he does, and where he's coming from those people.
In 1992, in the way this country conducts presidential campaigns, who leads who, the advisors or the presidential candidate?
Well, we addressed this in there. We have a chicken and egg problem. You never know whether the candidate was that way before the advisor came along or the advisors have influenced the candidates. We felt that it was enough of a public service to start with, sort of like throwing a bucket of paint on the wall, just to list the people and to attempt to understand which came first, who influenced whom, was a little bit beyond what we could do at the time, because you would have to spend hours and hours and hours with the candidate as well as the advisors, and you would have to have extraordinary candor over a period of weeks and months, and frankly we didn't think we would get that kind of access, so we didn't attempt it.
I want to talk a little bit more in depth about what you found, but let me tell people a little bit more about you. Founder and chairman and executive director of the Center for Public Integrity. What is the organization? How long has it been around, and who funds it?
Right. The organization is a research organization. I used to work in the media myself. I formed this group about 2 years ago. We've been in our offices. The idea is to provide the American people, but the media, everyone, anyone, with information about public service and ethics-related issues in Washington. We do 10,000 to 100,000 word studies about all kinds of things, from the S&L mess to EPA Superfund to the Persian Gulf media restrictions to you name it, Congress. We've done quite a bit on. And the idea is we do what most of the media would like to do maybe, but they don't have time, in essence. Most of our studies take at least a year. And we publish these studies and we release them at press conferences. We are funded primarily by foundations. We have media consulting with networks and PBS, and we do have some money from business and labor as well. We're a young organization and we're still kind of on the move here. We have folks like Arthur Schlesinger and Harding Carter and Father Hesburgh of Notre Dame and Kathleen Hall Jamieson and lots of interesting folks in journalism and historians and all kinds of folks who are on the advisory board. And so that's sort of what we do.
Let's talk more specifically about the particular candidates. Let's start with the president. If you look at George Bush's advisors in the 1992 campaign, can you draw conclusions for us?
You can draw certain conclusions. I did a story when I was at 60 Minutes in '88, and we found that, among other things, he had a large number of lobbyists working for overseas corporations and governments. And in the story that we did, we found that there were 10 advisors. In '92, not that much has changed, and some of those people are the same people. The one that we talked about a fair amount when we released the study was the deputy chairman of the campaign, James Lake, and we found that, among other things, he is registered on behalf of the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which is the majority shareholder for BCCI, which most people would regard as one of the more corrupt banks in history, and it's under 7 federal grand jury investigations. Mr. Lake disagreed with our, I mean, he didn't deny that he works for them, but he did not feel that was a conflict of interest. But there were other folks doing similar kinds of work, working for various overseas corporations. The other thing that we found that we thought was kind of interesting, on the issue of health care, which most Americans seem to be very concerned about this year, we found that his principal advisor, Deborah Steelman, is a registered lobbyist before the Congress on behalf of hospitals and insurance companies and large, multi-billion-dollar entities that deal with health care. Now, some people would wonder about that. They'd wonder what kind of view on health care George Bush would have with those kinds of people advising him. Would John Q. Public be represented? But anyway, we sort of had a sense that we were learning something about the candidate. I mean, when you look at the trade policies, you look at the health care policies and some of the other policies, and you see who some of these folks are around them, the policies suddenly make more sense. You understand why he has those policies.
I'm going to take a second out here and give you the telephone call so you can participate. We'll go to the phones as quickly as we can here so we can involve you in the discussion. If you live in the Eastern or Central time zones, 202-628-2525. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, 202-783-2727. And if you watch regularly, you do know about our 30-day policy, so we're going to ask you to abide by it this evening. Governor Bill Clinton.
Right. I think what surprised us the most about Clinton was you know, there was a lot of rhetoric in this campaign in the early primaries, especially about people running against Washington, this sort of fiery rhetoric and populism about this city. And here was a governor of a state, Arkansas, with about 2/3 of his policy advisors were from this town. And we found that he also had a substantial number, approximately 10 advisors, with either registered at the Justice Department as foreign agents representing overseas interests, or having done certain deals or worked in one way or another for such interests. We've found some other things that were kind of intriguing. He had a few people who were from the natural gas industry, and I wasn't an expert on that. Arkansas is not a real well-known natural gas state, has less than 1% of the country's production. And Clinton has talked about natural gas and talked about the country turning to natural gas. And so we found that that was kind of intriguing. One of the advisors has, his family owns a 38% interest in a bank down in Arkansas, which has extended a $2 million line of credit to the campaign. And so these relationships did not seem inconsequential, which is why we mentioned them.
Okay, we're going to do one more before we get
Sure.
to calls, and we can talk about some of the other candidates either with our callers, or if we don't, you and I can get to it. But in this issue of Time Magazine, the cover story is on Ross Perot. They do a piece where they look at, and I'll show you this, Perot's lieutenants here. And now that I've shown it to you, I need you to take a quick shot so I can read it. The top members of Perot's team have at least 3 things in common. They are not ideologues. They have never belonged to the East Coast order of political druids who climb onto campaigns and television talk shows, and they have achieved great success with a low-key, unassuming intensity. Your comment?
Well, in our study, we did not focus on Perot. He was not a factor at the time. But from everything I've heard up to this point, Perot, well, his campaign, or whatever is occurring here, is in its infancy. But it does appear, from everything I've heard, that that is the case, that most of these people who are starting to be drawn, I mean the actual policy types, that he is starting to consult, I don't think are part of this inside the Beltway mentality or establishment, these elites that we've been dealing with. So I would not dispute that article. I wish we had more information right now. We're looking around.
Solana Beach, California, our first question of the evening.
Yes. Question for your guest. Do you think any of the advisors would have the courage to tell their people that no matter what the candidates do or what the country tries to do to extricate the minority group from the poverty class, whether it's more jobs or education or what have you, that the results will be the same so long as there are more people entering the poverty class because of the teenage pregnancy problem than there are extricating themselves from the poverty class. In short, as long as the ship is taking on water faster than it's being bailed out, that ship's going to drown.
Thank you.
It's a great question. And it's kind of a tricky question. It's hard to know what kind of advice these candidates get exactly, and the level of access each of these advisors has to the candidates. If what the candidates say is any indication publicly, you have to think that the level of candor is not particularly high. I don't think any of, well, the 2 major candidates have particularly addressed the issue you just raised in light of the riots. I think if you look at the early statements by both candidates, I had the distinct sense I was on a different planet. When you say that the court system worked well, and you wait for the appeals process, which of course there is no appeals process when there's an acquittal, and the other candidate says he's going to sign the crime bill, I'm not sure that really addresses these issues that the gentleman raises. So I'm not convinced. Maybe they're not all that candid. That's a great question.
Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Hi, good evening. Who pays all these advisors? I've kind of got in on the middle of the conversation, but are these advisors paid by the taxpayers or by foundations, or are there any that are volunteers? And does Mr. Lewis believe that all the advisors that the politicians have, are they really necessary to do? They really do any good?
Well, let me answer the second part. I do think a candidate needs advisors. A lot of these issues are fairly complicated, and depends on the candidate. Some of these candidates have been around for a long time and they know these issues themselves already. But other candidates are new to some of these issues, and I don't think anyone thinks they shouldn't have people talk to them occasionally. As to the money part, we focus very, very heavily on the volunteer advisors. My reasoning was, I think it's most interesting to know what these people do during their day jobs. They want to be known as the advisor to the Clinton campaign or the Bush campaign, but I want to know who pays their salary during the day. And the taxpayer does not pay their salary, and the campaign, most of the times in these instances, does not pay their salary. Usually, a large corporation or a trade association or an industry or some kind of large entity in this town pays their salary. A lot of these people that we dealt with. James Lake, to go back, not to center on him, but it could be anybody, but he makes several $100,000 a year from all the various clients, Japan Auto Parts manufacturers, Suzuki, Minolta, Mitsubishi, and you can take any one of these advisors and look at their clients, and most of them don't brown bag it to lunch, and they are well-heeled, and they come from large interests.
Would you spend just a minute commenting on Jerry Brown's advisors?
We found that in the case of Brown, most of his advisors were not from inside the Beltway. They were academic types outside Washington. And we found that where he had done a lot of rhetoric about running against Washington and not including these people, it appeared that that was the case in terms of his advisors. I should say that we had a limitation with this study. Candidates are not required in any way to disclose their advisors. The Federal Election Commission doesn't require it. No other law requires it. So we went to the campaigns and asked them for their advisors. One campaign was a little bit cagey with us and didn't want to give us all the names.
Which one was that?
Tsongas, with just one part of his advisors on one subject. But generally speaking, we got lists from people. One campaign used it as a resume building exercise. If the candidate had bumped into someone in an airport 2 years ago, he would be listed as an advisor. So we tried to separate the real advisors from the resume building lists, and we tried to shake it all out and come up with a name.
Now, you know, as a former journalist, you can't leave me hanging with one part of the campaign he wouldn't give the advisors out on. Which
well,
one
it was the trade advisors. We got a couple names of academic types at think tanks, which is fairly innocuous. We assume that a lot of these PhD economists and others are giving advice and are proud to give it and excited and are useful in terms of their information. That is also not, if you're looking at potential conflicts, that's obviously not a conflict, or to most people it isn't. And we didn't get the other advisors, and we know that there were other advisors. We were told by the campaign. So, but I have to also caution, we did not know whether or not Senator Tsongas was aware that his campaign wasn't given. We made every effort to tell the campaign to please give us these names. I can't tell who knew and who didn't know and all the motives. I just know we didn't get the names.
New York City, thanks for waiting. You're on the air.
Hi. Well, you answered part of my question. It was about Jerry Brown's advisors. If you could talk more about it, because I think it's interesting. And also, do you think that if he maybe has had different advisors, or if that he might have done better in the race? Thank you.
Sure. Well, I don't know how much more to say about his advisors other than to go down each one name by name or something. But your second part of your question is really a fascinating issue to me, because I do think that many Americans share some of the issues Brown was saying, and it seemed at key moments that he was catching fire, so to speak. I think part of the problem with Brown is, to use his own phrase about his own candidacy, he maybe is a flawed vessel. Most people, this is a man who had run 3 or 4 times for the presidency and has been on different sides of almost every issue. And I think at some point people wonder where exactly he's coming from. And he would have eloquent answers to explain where he was coming from at every turn. But I think at some point that became a problem for him, especially in New York for some reason. I've been trying to figure out exactly what did happen in New York, but something came out of his campaign up there that kind of started to falter. The other thing about Brown that is most interesting to me is the media's response. Up until Connecticut, where he won in the primary or the caucuses, whichever they were, the national media generally seemed to ignore Brown. And there did seem to, Brown said this, but frankly, I kind of agree with him. And so there are these, we don't live in a perfect world, and it is a very subjective thing. These reporters had been around the bend several times with Jerry Brown, and they had their own preconceived notions before it even started, I think. And I think that may have hurt him somewhat.
Charles Lewis has a bachelor's in political science from the University of Delaware and a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Next question for him is from Anaheim. You're on the air.
Yes, you know, there have been implications in recent years that both Ronald Reagan and George Bush were influenced and somewhat funded by the Reverend Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church. And now, of course, Donald Gregg is our ambassador to South Korea. He was also implicated in Iran-Contra. And sometimes I think that if a group of people had sat down in 1980 and tried to figure out a way to systematically destroy this country, they couldn't have done a better job than Reagan and Bush. Do you see any implication in that with the Unification Church?
We have this preoccupation in this country whenever things go wrong to blame outsiders, and I've fallen prey to it myself occasionally. I mean, the only thing I have ever seen with Unification Church or the Moon organization you're referring to, there are very strong ties with that organization and its subsidiaries with, I have to be very blunt and frank, with several conservative think tanks and conservative organizations which were extremely excited and supportive of Reagan and Bush. No one, well, I suppose someone could probably try to establish a link directly into Reagan and Bush. I don't think anyone has ever done that. But I don't think the Moon policies or the Moon agenda or whatever you want to call it had anything to do with what happened in the 80s. I don't think there's a connection. I think there are too many other forces that are much more substantial that affected this country. I don't know if it's appropriate to mention, but my favorite thing I've read in terms of investigative reporting, maybe ever, certainly this year, is the Bartlett and Steele series in the Philadelphia Inquirer, America, What Went Wrong. Reading that kind of stuff tells me what happened in the 80s, and I don't think it's Reverend Moon.
We have your address for your organization on screen. If people write you, can they get a copy of your report?
Yes, for printing reasons, we have to charge $10, I'm afraid. But yeah, we're happy to send it out.
Take our next question. It's from Pensacola, Florida.
Good evening. You've already had somebody call in and ask about Jerry Brown's advisors. I would like to ask about one in particular. I can't remember his name, but he seemed to be a very unusual character that sort of always wore black, wore a beret.
Mr. Borghese, I think it is?
I'm not sure. Right? I was just, he seemed very interesting, sort of a person, and I would like to know more about him. Thank you.
Well, I would too, actually. Frankly, it was, we did not go into enormous detail about him. The gentleman, Jacques Barzaghi, I guess. Mm-hmm. I've never met this gentleman, but there have been quite a few articles about him. The tricky part in an exercise like this about advisors is to ascertain the degree of access and the kind of access that a person has to the candidate. It appeared that in this gentleman's case, it was more of a personal friendship going back many, many years. That doesn't mean he would not influence him in policy, but he was not a quote-unquote policy advisor in the more traditional sense of the word. His background and his whole demeanor seems kind of fascinating to me too, frankly, but I don't know much more about that, I'm afraid.
How about Patrick Buchanan's advisors?
Well, Buchanan was an interesting case because unlike Brown, here's a man who was born here in Washington and has lived and worked in Washington for basically all his life, and yet was railing against Washington, was doing all this populist rhetoric, and on the foreign trade issue was very concerned about lobbying and revolving door and some of those issues. We found that in the advisor issue, he did not seem to have large numbers of these kinds of advisors. In other words, he was, again, sort of like Brown, he was being fairly straight, at least it appeared on the surface from the names we got. One explanation for this may be Buchanan has been a columnist and has been a pundit on all these issues for a good 20 years, which suggests to me he already knows what he thinks. And if he doesn't know, he can look up what he wrote 10 years ago on just about everything. So maybe he didn't need these people.
Winter Park, Florida.
Seems that President Bush doesn't have any political ethics advisors at all, because when President Vytautas Landsbergis of Lithuania declared independence from the Soviets, Bush invited him to the White House, but snuck him in through the side door to come in and see him. But when Gorbachev called on him, and of course Landsbergis was partially or wholly responsible for the toppling of the Soviet Union, but when Gorbachev came in to see Bush, Bush welcomed him with open arms as a big hero, and yet Gorbachev was a villain. He tried to keep communism alive in the Soviet Union. I'd like you to comment on that.
Wow. That's an interesting point. We could get into a long discussion, probably for several hours, about ethics, and George Bush did say that he wanted to be the ethics president. There are several problems and things that he is encountering right now, from the whole Iraq-gate subject, which is starting to get more attention, the BNL scandal down in Atlanta. His chief of staff, Sam Skinner, has got problems with his travels that he took. Ironically, he was brought in because Sununu before him had problems with perks. And there are lots of other potentially eyebrow-raising things and problems that people around Bush have had. On the specific issue of Gorbachev, rightly or wrongly, I think most people are a little more sympathetic to Gorbachev, probably, than the sentiment that you express. And I'm not an expert on the Lithuanian thing. One of the frustrations for me always watching diplomatic things are all the protocols and all the games that are played. And we decide whether or not we're going to recognize a country if we like what that country does after a certain number of years. And some countries we never like. It always reminded me of a kid taking second base and going home and not playing anymore. There's a certain pettiness to these things that get on my nerves, frankly. But I don't know the nuances and niceties of the Lithuanian situation.
Before founding the Center for Public Integrity, Mr. Lewis was an investigative reporter for ABC News from 1977 through 1984 and joined CBS and had assignments that included 60 Minutes and was with CBS until 1988. Next question for him is from San Rafael, California.
Yes, good evening. I don't think there is any level of integrity on the subject of public integrity if we don't discuss the issue of the Israeli lobby, which all the people who discuss the issues of integrity in public life, they always evade this issue because they're usually part of the Israeli lobby. Now, I would like to ask this gentleman, I mean, there's a difference between lobbying for a domestic concern like the farmers, like the banks, like et cetera, and lobbying for a foreign nation, which is highly unkosher. My question is, do you think it's okay for people to lobby for a foreign government, let's say Japan, Iraq, Libya, Israel, etc.? And the second question is, who finances your center, and if you can please give names. Thank you.
Okay. My basic position on all of these things, I think that anyone who has business in this town or in this country has a right to have someone represent them. I don't dispute that. We believe in the First Amendment and all these other constitutional guarantees. I don't think anyone has a problem with that, and we're not going to be so xenophobic that we decide any overseas interest can't be represented. Where I draw the line, or where I have a problem, or where I scratch my head, so to speak, is when a former U.S. official who upheld the public trust, representing the American public interest, goes to work for an overseas interest. To me, that crosses some kind of line. We did a trade study about the White House agency that conducts trade, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. We found that half of the top officials running that agency over 20 years went to work for the people they used to negotiate against. I think that is very troublesome. One of the things we mentioned in our recent study, and in fact another study we did before that, Craig Fuller, the former Vice President Bush's chief of staff, for a time was president of Hill & Knowlton, which represented Citizens for a Free Kuwait, and they received $10 million for that account. That was excessive amount of money and a lot of lobbying, and the point of it was to bring America into the war. The head of Hill & Knowlton said that the purpose of their mission was to do just that, to come into the war. My point is, when overseas interests are retaining our former officials with close ties into the White House and other top places, and they're trying to bring this country into a foreign conflict, and large sums of money, millions of dollars are being spent. When video news releases, 60 million video news releases are sent out to local TV stations and things, that gets that's of great concern to me. Then you are intruding into the political process. Your specific question about AIPAC, I assume you're referring to the Israeli lobby. That's not different from the Japanese lobby or any other overseas lobby. Yes, there's a substantial presence in this town. No one would dispute that. And there would probably have been excesses with that group as well as any other. I don't think anyone would argue with. Well, they probably would argue with it, but I certainly don't dispute that.
He also asked about your funder
Right.
specifically.
Right. We have our budget last year was approximately $350,000, which is very small. We're in a David and Goliath situation here. 55% of our funding came from foundations. Some of the foundations include Bill Moyers' foundation, the Schumann Foundation, the Philip Stern Family Fund, the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, the J. Robert MacArthur Foundation, places like that. We have retainer agreements, consultant contracts that we have done on occasion with PBS Frontline, the TV show, and ABC News. And we have received also money from some companies and labor unions. And if anyone would like specifics beyond that, I'm happy to give it to them if they want to call the center.
Dayton, Ohio.
Yes, I'm a Franklin Roosevelt buff, and I've been reading a lot about what happened with him before he became president and afterwards. In terms of the people he sought out for advice, the Brains Trust, Rexford Tugwell, and others, the political process was much simpler then, of course. It's much corrupted now. But I think it's useful to go back because the times are similar in a certain respect of a world and a domestic economic crisis, and yet different. Of just what kind of the kind of people he sought out and how he did it. At the same time, he improvised. He never had specifics when he ran for office. He had very general and genial proposals to make. But people trusted him, and he improvised as he got in, and he improvised in many different respects. So we look for specifics, and yet I don't think any president candidate really has ever delivered specifics. I think you're looking for character and the kind of people around him and the kind of imagination and guts the man has. And if you just comparing, if you read anything about FDR and the kinds of, back to that era, I guess.
All right. Thank you, sir. We get the point of your question.
I agree with a lot of your comments. I have not done a specific comparison between the two, but I have heard people recently make comparisons with the Perot candidacy, for example, and the early Roosevelt, the 32 campaign. As I understand it, and I'm not an expert, and I've not gone back and studied this, Roosevelt was not clear about a lot of these positions, but the country did think he was a good man or he had good intentions. And a lot of the brain trusters he brought in were brilliant people in their own right throughout the country who had public service in mind and wanted to get the country moving again and get it out of the doldrums it was in. Part of the reason the center was created, frankly, is a perception that public service in this country and government is no longer, people don't enter it for the same reasons. We now have people who want to punch their ticket and build their resume, and so they can get a really great job in the private sector. And you have former secretaries of states and former speakers of the House doing airline commercials. And you have former presidents giving speeches for $2 million. And there's this sort of marketplace mentality. And a lot of the advisors now don't advise because they're great Democrats with a small d. They do it because it looked great on their resume. And one of the reasons we tried to create the center was to try to highlight these issues in a systemic way. Look at the S&L crisis, look at the EPA Superfund program, look at Congress and what's happened to that institution. And take the high road and not focus on one hapless soul, look at the whole picture, but get an idea of what's happened. And clearly something's happened in this country. The major institutions of government are no longer respected as they once were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the American people are fed up. And it's pretty obvious from a lot of the calls, but things we keep reading and hearing.
Carbondale, Pennsylvania.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Lewis if he would support the nomination of Howard Stern.
Nomination for what?
I suspect it's for president. We'll let that
Right.
comment go. Did you look at all at the pollsters? And
Well,
does it matter who their pollsters are?
You know, we didn't look at the, other than saying who the pollsters were, we didn't really look at them in great depth. There is a whole school of thought that is sort of an anti-pollster school of thought that candidates don't know what they think about anything. They stick their finger up and see which way the wind's blowing, and they take daily tracking polls to see what people think today or yesterday. And there are pollsters who sell breakfast cereal and also work for these candidates. And I find some of that disturbing, to say the least, but we did not focus on it.
Los Angeles, your question.
Yes, I seem to recall during the Iran-Contra hearings that there were a group of private individuals that contributed to the Contras, and wasn't Ross Perot one of those people?
My understanding of that is, I don't know that anyone has documented that he contributed. His role in that whole situation is Ollie North and the people conducting Iran-Contra asked Perot on one occasion, maybe more than one occasion, to give money, contribute money to as ransom for hostages in Lebanon and in Iran to try to help, particularly Lebanon, I guess, Beirut, to get them out. And on one instance, I think Perot gave $2 million to the group to try to get someone out. Other than being, and Perot viewed that at the time, and he has said this publicly, that he viewed that as a patriotic gesture. He was called on by his country to help in a moment of need. Now, people can make their own judgments about that, but what, the distinction that I think someone maybe needs to make, or it hasn't been made yet, or maybe it's been made and I don't know it, was the relationship any more than that? Was he part of the private funding network? I don't know the extent of that network. I don't have a list of all the names of the people. But that would be a very interesting thing to explore, and I'm sure it will be explored.
Rockville, Maryland.
Hi. You know, when I was watching the build-up to the Kuwaiti war here with Iraq, I could see strong suggestion inside the coming out of the Bush cabinet that we wouldn't go and fight to reinstall the dictatorship back in Kuwait. But it seems like immediately after this prince and kings got back in power, they just shut down all the liberal papers and other political party, and the Bush White House decided not to do anything, well, not for us being public, decided to do anything about it. I want to ask you, why wouldn't they do something about it? And wouldn't we have some say in it? Because after all, Americans did die for that country, and we, and far as I understand, what was going to war for was to finally at least bring democracy to the Kuwaiti people. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. I think you're trying to find logic in a very illogical situation. It's very interesting today to try to figure out what we exactly were doing over there. We are now watching an unfolding, I think, scandal about the relationship between the Bush administration and the Reagan administration, but then the Bush administration with Saddam Hussein. We clearly propped him up. We clearly, he was our guy vis-a-vis Iran. We funneled all kinds of agricultural credits and equipment and military equipment and chemical warfare equipment and all kinds of things to him all the way up to the time of the invasion. We gave him mixed signals about whether or not we would retaliate if he did anything against Kuwait. And we ignored the plight of the Kurds, thousands of whom were killed by Saddam Hussein back in '88. And so to try to then, in a symmetrical way, look at what we did in the war and how are things there now and do we care in Kuwait. And this whole thing is totally all over the board. And frankly, we don't know really what's going on. I don't think the American people to this day know exactly what happened between Iraq and the U.S. leading up to the war. And I don't think we fully understand the relationships between Kuwait and the U.S. or Saudi Arabia and the U.S. And I hope that over the coming months we'll learn more. I certainly want to know more.
Willimantic, Connecticut is next.
Hi. I'm a first-time caller. I had a comment to make about Mr. Barzagi. I read an awful lot about Jerry Brown when his candidacy surged forward. And I found him very exciting and interesting, and I can't say he's any more flawed than anyone else who's been president or who may be running for president. I think he's a brilliant man. I'm not in awe of him of any of the others. But he met Mr. Barzagi Mr. Barzagi met him at a party I read in the New York Times in Laurel Canyon, California, when Brown was governor. And it described Brown as having on a pair of blue jeans, and he was Secretary of State, I believe. And Barzagi did not know him or recognize him. And he started talking about the plight of a particular American Indian group. I don't remember which one it was. And they struck up this long, deep conversation, as you can imagine, with Brown's interests and orientation. And they became fast friends. And what impressed Brown about Barzagi was that he didn't know who Brown was and was not impressed with Brown. He just started talking very sincerely about this issue. And that's how their relationship started, as I read it in the New York Times. And about the media, I want to say that when they did start to cover Mr. Brown, I was constantly upset and uncomfortable and frankly enraged. And I've lost a lot of respect for political pundits and journalists that I've been watching for years, because when they did cover him, notwithstanding Mr. Brown's stand on issues, there was a certain tone and attitude and disrespect for Jerry Brown that I found outrageous.
Okay, thanks very much.
I don't know what more to say about Mr. Barzagi. I read that article too, and he is an intriguing fellow. I agree with a lot of your sentiment about pundits and people inside the Beltway in general, frankly. We try to do what we do at the center every day as though we don't live here. And for example, there are a lot of people wringing their hands and concerned and looking at the sky about, oh my gosh, we're going to lose 50 to 100 members of Congress, and this place will never be the same, and we're losing all these people with all this expertise. And they looked at Brown as a threat, and who is this guy from California? And then they looked at Perot, who is this guy from Texas? He's not a politician, he can't. Then they saw the polls and they said, well, he'll sink. But the point I'm making is these pundits, I think, get on everybody's nerves, and they are part of the fabric. It's not a coincidence why the HUD scandal and the Iran-Contra scandal and the SNL crisis was not reported in Washington, that it spilled out other places or the media was slow. It's because a lot of the folks in this town are part of the story, and they're part of the fabric. They have dinner with these people, they have lunch with these people, and they lose their perspective. And I think your concerns are very, very well founded.
We're out of time. At that point, I'll say thank you for being with us this evening. Our guest is Charles Lewis. He runs an organization called the Center for Public Integrity. His latest report is called Under the Influence: Presidential Candidates and Their Campaign Advisors. Do you have any more political reports coming out before the election?
We have several. We're going to update this one, and we have another one about the political parties. We have one about the SNL crisis, so that has a particular presidential campaign tilt to it, or focus. And we'll be back.
Thank you for taking our viewers' questions.
Thanks.
Thank you for participating. Have a good night.